I know I say this all the time, but we do have a fantastic, fantastic show today. Everybody is recognizing that our government is really in chaos, trying to rectify what happened in the last 4 years, etc. And it is chaotic for everybody. So today's guest is the foremost authority on the Constitution. And he's just finished, and it came out today, his newest book, which, by the way, is number 57, and 58 is being worked. There it is, The Preventive State. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And we have a lot of constitutional ramifications. And he is the expert, former, actually now Professor Emeritus of Harvard Law School, the guy. So I want to thank you again, Alan, for being on the show. This is about the fourth or fifth time we've talked, and I always learn something new from you. So thanks for taking the time to answer some of these questions that are haunting all of us.
Well, thank you for having me. I always learn from you when you ask me hard questions. So,
well, today I had my notes for today, and they're really phenomenal questions. And I know we're going to get very interesting and authoritative answers. So people are raising the question, can Trump do what he's doing in a lot of ways? And we'll get into some specifics. And the allegation is being made that he's basically heading toward a dictatorship, and that our democracy really is at stake. And does anybody really know what to do about it? So what do you think? Do you think it's possible he could take over as a dictator?
So I did a study a few years ago when I defended President Trump on the floor of the Senate against what I believe was an unconstitutional impeachment charge in which he was accused of abuse of power. And I found out that of our presidents of the United States, I think it was 43 of them had been accused of abuse of power, starting, of course, with John Adams, who had enacted the Alien Sedition Act. Jefferson accused him of an abuse of power. Then when Jefferson was elected in a hotly disputed election, and he refused to recognize the midnight judges that Adams had appointed, leading to Marbury versus Madison, they thought that was an abuse of power and that we were heading toward tyranny. Andrew Jackson accused John Quincy Adams of abusing democracy and denying him the presidency. Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. We had Hayes election. Franklin Delano Roosevelt threatened to pack the court, allowed the detention of 110,000 illegally detained American citizens of Japanese descent. Our country and our Constitution has been through many, many, many constitutional conflicts. We've only had one constitutional crisis in our history, legal crisis, and then one, obviously, military crisis. The legal crisis was when Justice Jackson, Andrew Jackson, said to the Chief Justice, "You've rendered the decision, now you enforce it, I'm not going to enforce it." A decision involving the rights of Native Americans. That was a constitutional crisis. The only time in our history that a president refused to obey an order of the Supreme Court. The Lincoln case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court essentially ruled against him. During Roosevelt's term, he threatened to pack the court. And what happened was one or two of the justices changed their views, and the historians call it the switch in time that shaved nine, because had they not switched, had they not started to uphold the New Deal, Roosevelt would have packed the court, and that would have probably destroyed the court. So we've had constitutional conflicts. One crisis, Andrew Jackson, one military crisis that couldn't be resolved under our Constitution, the Civil War, then it needed a 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But our Constitution, our system of checks and balances has endured many, many, many controversies. And I'm relatively confident, not 100%, relatively confident that our Constitution can endure 4 years of Donald Trump.
Well, there was a report the last couple of days that he was considering suspension of the writ of habeas corpus.
Right.
And we know what that means among us lawyers, but the public doesn't know. What exactly is habeas corpus?
Well, let me tell you a story about Harvard So last week or 2 weeks ago, they discovered in the Harvard Law Library, where I spent so much of my time, I wrote 100 articles. I did them all in the library. They discovered an original copy of the Magna Carta written in 1215. I was at the 750th anniversary of the Magna Carta in Westminster Abbey. I was there, sent there as Harvard's official representative. And the Magna Carta, of course, essentially originates the writ of habeas corpus. What it essentially says is that nobody can be imprisoned, nobody can be confined without him having or her having access to the courts. Habeas corpus means essentially produce the body. And so it's a writ directed to the jailer or the judge who put the person in, saying, produce the body, bring him to court, and then we'll see whether there's a legal justification for holding him. The writ of habeas corpus has been suspended about a half a dozen times in American history. It was suspended by Abraham Lincoln illegally during the Civil War. Then Congress authorized the suspension, which maybe legitimated it. The Supreme Court ultimately said that the consequences of the suspension had to be undone, and they were undone. It was suspended after Pearl Harbor. In Hawaii, General Richardson declared martial law and suspended the writ of habeas corpus. It was also suspended in a number of states during the Reconstruction period. A number of states have suspended the writ of habeas corpus during Union riots, etc. But in our history of what's 225 years now, we've hardly ever seen the writ suspended. In my view, is that the Supreme Court would not uphold. It would be 9-0, and it would rebuke President Trump and say, under Article 1, remember the writ of habeas corpus appears in Article 1, which is congressional article. You cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus without the approval of Congress, and Congress is not going to approve the suspension. So I don't think it's going to happen.
What would the effect be of a suspension?
It would mean that people who are being deported couldn't go to court and get relief. Deportation, interestingly enough, is a mechanism of prevention. I've written this book called The Preventive State, which deals with legal mechanisms for preventing violence, and deportation is one of them. We deport people purportedly in order to prevent them from committing gangland crimes and other kinds of crimes. It's probably a pretty cumbersome and awkward way of preventing, but it is one of the genre of preventive measures that I discussed in my book. And it would mean that if you were deported, as we have had now several dozen people deported, they couldn't go to the court and get a writ of habeas corpus issued. Now, many of them are in court, and the courts have ruled that some of them have to be returned, some of them have to come back to where they were detained, all of that. So the writ of habeas corpus is still operative. And if the president were to suspend it, it would not be operative. Now, he didn't say it. President Trump didn't say it. Steve Miller said that the administration was considering the possibility of the writ of habeas corpus. The president did say, however, that he would comply with the orders of the Supreme Court. He would not violate an order of the Supreme Court. And I am completely confident. I'm sometimes called Nostra Dershowitz because my predictions have almost all come true about how we deal with legal issues. And my prediction here with 100% certainty is that the Supreme Court would not uphold a presidential order suspending the writ of habeas corpus not occurring during a rebellion, an invasion, or wartime.
What's interesting is historically, more people were deported under Obama and Clinton than were being deported or are being deported by Trump. Is that historically correct?
Yeah, but Trump is making it a big political issue. The others did it quietly and without a lot of interference from the ACLU or other organizations. But since Trump campaigned on a promise to deport all the bad guys, not people who have been living here peacefully with families, although they ultimately may get deported, but the worst first. And so it's become a big issue. And Of course, there are 40 cases now pending all over the country challenging it. And of course, this morning we heard arguments in the Supreme Court as to whether a single judge can issue orders that bind the administration all over the country. And we'll hear the results of that probably within the next couple of months.
Well, it's kind of interesting too, and you and I and lawyers generally use terms that are kind of indigenous to the law practice in the law world. And one of those terms is called due process.
Right.
Public really doesn't understand, other than the Supreme Court said you have to give these people due process. So the natural question is, what does due process mean?
Very few lawyers understand the term. I've actually studied it very closely and gone back and done research on the history of due process. It's a very simple term. It's variable. There's no single definition of due process. What due process means is, this sounds reductionistic, but it's the best definition. The process that is due to you, depending on who you are. So if you're an American citizen and you're charged with a crime, your due process involves indictment by a grand jury, having a lawyer represent you if you can't afford one, presumption of innocence, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the right to appeal, the full panoply of rights. That's due process for a citizen charged with crime. What about a non-citizen who's trying to sneak over the border and who makes it past the fence and is 10 feet in the United States? He gets due process too. His due process is, the immigration officer asks him, are you a citizen? Are you a green card holder? Can you produce a piece of paper? And if the answer is no, he can be physically taken and put back over the line and sent back to Mexico or Canada or whatever country he's from. So his due process is very different from the due process that a citizen is accorded. Now, you have a lot of intermediate cases. You have, for example, student visas, and very little due process for that. If a student violates the terms of his visa, and the government has to demonstrate that, but it's pretty easy to demonstrate, that student can be deported. Even a green card holder can be deported if, for example, he got his green card based on false information, which is claimed for some of the people who are under consideration now. So due process varies with who the person is, what they're trying to do to him, and the context.
And some of that is really being applied against these alleged student protests, which are not really all student protests. From what I am able to discern, some of these people are paid agitators that are out there yelling and screaming slogans that they don't understand.
Yep.
And so the question is, can some of those people be deported? And we have the case in front of us now where this leader, this ringleader, this rebel is being considered to be deported, and we've already deported Mr. Garcia. So is this what's being used as a basis to deport them?
Yeah, and it depends on what the status is. For example, NYU today withheld a graduation degree from a young man who had submitted a speech that he was going to make at graduation, and it was a pablum speech. Congratulations, class. It's great that you're all graduating. Go out and do great things. And instead, he tore up his speech and he railed against Israel and called America as complicitous in genocide. And he got standing ovations from the students. And NYU has said, we're withholding his degree because he lied to us. Now, if he were a visa student, perhaps he could be deported for violating the rules of the university, because if you're thrown out of your university and you no longer are a student, your student status ended. But if he's a citizen or a green card holder, then he can be disciplined by the university. They can refuse to give him his degree, but he can't be deported. So it depends, again, on what your status is in the country.
Well, what's interesting, and it's another one of those terms that is bandied around almost every day because you read about it in the media, and that's called executive order. And I know, and you know, that presidents have been using executive orders forever. Whatever they want to do, they do, and call it an executive order. So tell us what exactly is an executive order and when it can be issued and if it can be issued.
Well, we don't really know. Based on the Constitution, there was no such concept when the Constitution was enacted. But of course, Jefferson, shortly after coming into office, issued what we would today call an executive order. Trump would have loved it. He made a great deal. He bought the Louisiana Purchase for nothing, just like Seward bought Alaska for nothing. Trump would love those deals. He'd love to do it with Greenland.
Yeah, I was going to say Greenland.
Right. He's not going to be able to do it. But executive orders simply mean, under Article 2 of the Constitution, which is the presidential article, executive actions that are permissible. Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered the detention of 110,000 American citizens, probably the single worst violation of civil liberties that any president ever committed in the history of our country. You could compare it to slavery, but slavery is in the Constitution. Putting 110,000 people in camps based on what their heritage is and what their national origin is as unconstitutional as anything could be. And the Supreme Court upheld it as a necessary executive order during wartime. Of course, we had just been attacked at Pearl Harbor. As I said, the General Richardson in charge of Pearl Harbor declared martial law. President Roosevelt did not declare martial law, but he did authorize the FBI to arrest and detain people of Japanese background, including American citizens. Many of them were American citizens. And so we've seen these executive orders. We saw them also even more recently during the McCarthy period. So they are essentially undemocratic, but they are permissible under Article 2 of the Constitution.
There's been some reference to the necessity as a condition precedent, really, that it be utilized only in situations where there's an emergency.
Right.
What do you understand emergency to be, or to qualify as an emergency to enable the issuance of an executive order?
Back in the 1960s, I wrote a law review article on that, emergencies and when emergency powers can be invoked. And there's no clear law on that. It was Justice Goldberg, for whom I clerked, who said, quoting Justice Jackson, I think, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And Thomas Jefferson previously had said, you can't have rules in the government that will destroy our government. And so necessity has implicitly been used, particularly by presidents, but also by justices of the Supreme Court, and often misused. And so there's no kind of legal definition of what is an emergency. And the real question is who gets to decide. And
that was the next question.
Yeah.
The reality is that executive orders come and go as the presidency changes. Executive orders that were issued by Biden,
yeah,
some of which were kind of, from my perspective anyway, ridiculous.
Yeah.
No longer the executive orders in effect have been either rescinded or modified, changed, or something issued that.
Yeah. Well, we're in the process of watching that right now.
What's
President Obama, after calling me into the Oval Office and asking me for advice, he then disregarded my advice and issued an executive order, essentially making a deal with Iran, giving them a pathway to developing nuclear weapons. That was an executive order. It wasn't a treaty. It should have been a treaty. It looked like a treaty. It quacked like a treaty. It walked like a treaty, but it wasn't a treaty, so it didn't need 2/3 of the Senate. Immediately upon taking office, Donald Trump rescinded that executive order and rescinded the non-treaty. Now Trump is in the process of trying to get a longer, stronger, better treaty with Iran, but a lot of his critics think he's not going to get one that's much better. He's going to just repeat the mistake that was made by Obama and validated by Biden. So this is a work in progress, and we'll see what happens. I hope he gets an agreement with Iran. It will be an agreement that absolutely prevents them from getting a nuclear arsenal. And if not, Israel may have to go on its own and destroy, or at least set back, the nuclear program. And they will do it. But of course, you don't upset Trump. Everybody now understands the Zelensky experience, and Netanyahu doesn't want to be the next Zelensky, so he's not going to want to get into a fight with Donald Trump. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. It's a delicate process.
Well, apparently nobody wants to get into a fight, because the next word comes from the TV show, the famous words, "You're fired."
Yeah.
That's what happens.
Fired upon, that could be even worse than being fired. You're fired upon. And if the United States were to get together with Israel and use bunker busting bombs, they could destroy the Iranian nuclear reactor. In fact, they could probably bring about regime change, which would be the greatest gift to the Arab countries in the Middle East if there was regime change and Iran were to become more like democracy. But I don't think Trump wants regime change. He can negotiate. He can make deals with the mullahs. He prefers negotiating with tyrants, whether it be, the head of some Arab countries, or the one thing he doesn't like is dealing with democracies, because when you deal with a democracy like Israel, you can't just tell the prime minister what to do. The prime minister doesn't have that power or the authority. Obviously, the Prince of Saudi Arabia does, the Emir of Qatar does, the head of Oman does, but Israel doesn't. So it's much easier for Trump to deal with dictatorships than it is to deal with democracies.
Well, one of the things that stands out in terms of the Iranian deal that was made by Obama is we, through the Obama administration, handed over billions of dollars to the Iranians, which was used to fund Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, and whoever it is. And so we, our then President Obama, gave him the financing to do it. Is that an accurate statement of history?
Absolutely, that's correct. And then it was repeated during the Biden administration when sanctions were removed and oil prices went up and Iran became wealthy again. Right now there are sanctions in place. And part of the deal that Iran is seeking to make is to end sanctions. And I would be in favor of ending sanctions if we could be 100, not 99, 100% certain that Iran would never develop nuclear weapons. Trump has also said that the deal must include that Iran has to stop funding terrorist groups like the Houthis and Hamas and Hezbollah. And I don't know whether they would ever do that. So although the president said we're close to a deal, I'm not sure how close we really are to a good deal. And, as a negotiator, if you're a lawyer, you're a negotiator. If you want a deal too much, too badly, you're likely to get a bad deal. And so what I worry about is the Iranians see that Trump is a deal maker and he wants to be able to announce that he's made a deal with Iran, that he's done something nobody else could do. He's really stopped Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And, if he actually does that, all power to him. But if he gives them a deal that allows them surreptitiously to move toward a nuclear arsenal, the world will suffer greatly from that.
Well, one of the things that's going on right now, and I want to address it briefly, is comments made by President Trump that he wants to impeach the judges that are ruling against him, like Boasberg and some of the others.
He can't do it.
The public doesn't know that. Tell them why he can't do it.
Well, the Constitution provides two. Number one, all public officials can be impeached only on grounds of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. You can't be impeached for rendering a bad decision, just like Trump couldn't be impeached for abuse of power or contempt of Congress, any of the things that were argued. So a judge can't be impeached. Now, judges are different than congressmen and presidents because the Constitution gives them tenure during, quote, good behavior. And so we've never seen this tested. But I can imagine the Trump administration saying that what Boasberg and others have done was not good behavior. And therefore, they can be removed, not necessarily impeached, because if you invoke impeachment, you got to go by the language of impeachment, but they can be removed for bad behavior. And that was disputed a little bit early in our history when you had judges who didn't commit impeachable offenses, but for example, who were drunk all the time or never showed up to work, or who, just did terrible, terrible things that weren't impeachable. Um, could you remove them for not good behavior? And we don't have a firm answer to that question.
Well, one of the things that's come up, and it's a big debate about it, is the orders coming from the Supreme Court, for example, on the immigration issue. And there apparently is a non-compliance. And it's pretty clear that there have been comments made that he's not going to follow the rules. Maybe yes, maybe no, but what happens if he ignores an order of the Supreme Court?
Well, it's interesting because people are arguing that he's already ignored an order that the Supreme Court said you have to facilitate the reentry of that guy from Maryland. Now, the Supreme Court made a mistake in that case. They just didn't understand the law. They made a mistake that if they were in my class, I would have given them a C minus. This guy from Maryland didn't have an order that prevented him from being deported. He just had an order prevented him from being deported to a particular country. And so there is absolutely no basis for the Supreme Court ordering him to be returned to the United States because the order didn't keep him in the United States. It just said he can't go to, I think it was Guatemala, or maybe he couldn't.
El Salvador, I think.
So El Salvador is where he went to, but the order itself actually mentioned a different country, and I think it was Guatemala. That was the one that he claimed he was in danger of, but they sent him to Salvador. So it's a very complicated case. The Supreme Court screwed up. They made a mistake, and they don't like to admit their mistakes. And so they did order that he be returned, but there's no basis in law for having him returned. I also think that when you deport somebody mistakenly, you can have them go to the American embassy and have a hearing by Zoom with a judge, with a lawyer. There is no basic reason to actually make him get on a plane, come back, have a 15-minute hearing, then put him back on the plane and go elsewhere. So I don't think the Supreme Court thought very hard about its order, but it is an order, and you can't violate an order of the court. And so there's an argument that Trump is in violation today because he hasn't facilitated his return. Now, Trump's lawyers say all facilitation means is that if he comes back to the United States, he has to be let in. That doesn't sound to me like a plausible interpretation. For me, facilitate means that he has to take affirmative actions to make sure he's brought back into the country. So there is an argument that he's violating an order of the Supreme Court. My view is that it was a mistaken order, but all courts make mistakes.
Well, the bottom line really is, let's assume for purposes of this discussion that there's a valid order from the Supreme Court and that there's a factual and evidentiary basis for the ruling,
right,
which of course is what you need. And he says, I'm not going to follow that order. What remedies are available to compel, which includes, of course, contempt? I mean, I used to threaten people all the time. So you don't do this, I got a room for you in the back. And you can sit there the rest of the day, and I'll get to you at 4:00. And so the bottom line is, what remedies are available in the event of a breach or a refusal to comply?
Well, contempt is the remedy that's available. It can be a fine. It can be a threat of imprisonment. It could be a daily fine. As Hamilton in the Federalist Papers said, the judiciary is the least dangerous branch because it has neither purse nor sword, but it has the contempt power, which, by the way, so does Congress. The president doesn't have the contempt power. People talk about the president as being the commander-in-chief. No, he's not the commander-in-chief. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He can't command me to do anything or you to do anything. He can command a soldier to do something, but he can't command an ordinary citizen to do something. So the executive is the only branch of government without contempt power. Both the judiciary and the legislature have contempt power. Legislature rarely uses it. Usually they go through the courts, but technically there is a jail in Congress, and Congress can order the marshal in arms to take somebody and put him in the jail.
That include the president?
Happened in the past.
Can it include the president?
Yes. There's no reason it can't include the president. It's not going to happen, but it could include the president. But the order has to be crystal clear, and he has to have a chance to challenge it. And so I don't think we're going to get there. But I don't understand why the White House didn't just bring this guy back, give him a 20-minute hearing. He would have lost because, after all, the idea of asylum, sending somebody now, it's discretionary. It's not a matter of law, and a judge doesn't have to grant it. And he's not really in danger. So he would have lost on the merits, but it would have been much better for the White House to facilitate his return, give him his due process hearing, and then if he loses, which he would have done, send him back. Now, he would have then appealed, and then we'd have an issue of whether you stay the order. But, that's the way the courts work, as you know, as a judge.
Well, what about the discretionary aspect of it? Is that pretty much you can do what you want to do, or does it have limitations?
Well, there are limitations to discretion. I taught my students for years, when you write an appellate brief, never use the word discretion. When you say that a judge has discretion, you're going to lose on appeal, because courts of appeals don't reverse judicial discretion. So I always would argue that what the judge did was ultra beyond the scope of what he was allowed to do, rather than an abuse of discretion. But some of my students didn't listen to me, and they still argued abuse of discretion, and almost always lost.
What about disobedience constituting a basis for another impeachment? Does it qualify?
It's not enough. There has to be treason or bribery or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, bribery can include accepting a bribe or giving one. And I guess the Democrats could argue that taking an airplane is taking a bribe. I mean, make those kinds of arguments. When I defended Trump, there wasn't even an allegation of treason or bribery or other high crimes and misdemeanors. They just made stuff up. And that's how we easily won that case. And I think would easily win if some of the Democrats impeached him again on grounds that were not in the Constitution itself.
What do you think about Trump's being able to withhold federal funds from certain businesses because they are being represented by law firms that had previously been against him?
Well, that's
Did he do it?
But the Democrats started this. They created an organization called the 65 Project, which was designed to go after lawyers who had defended Trump. They went after me. They filed a frivolous bar charge against me in Massachusetts, a frivolous bar charge against me in Arizona. I won all of my cases and got them all dismissed. It cost me $100,000, but in legal fees. But it's the Democrats who started this lawfare of going after lawyers and law firms. And inevitably, when one side starts, the other side's going to do it. And I wish neither side did it. Nobody should be attacked or subject to hard discipline based on doing what a lawyer is supposed to do.
In your opinion, do you think that the law firms would have some form of action
I do.
to be successful for that president going around them by cutting off their source of business?
I do. They would have some legal action. And I don't think universities do, though. I think universities are not entitled to be funded by the federal government, or not entitled necessarily to have tax exemptions. So I think if Harvard is suing the government, I think Harvard will lose. So
cutting off federal funding is a discretionary act by the president, which, unless there's an abuse of discretion, is sufficient to meet legal standards?
Yeah, or if it's done on racial grounds or other impermissible grounds, but if it's done because the president believes they're violating Title VI, that would be upheld, I think, by the courts.
I just want to kind of wrap it up with asking you, I'm looking at what's going on in the Middle East because I have a very vested interest in that. And it looks like the deals are being made, like the book, The Art of the Deal. Yeah. And it looks like there'll be a deal with the Saudis, etc. Qatar's already produced this $400 million airplane, whatever it is. And it's all about making deals right now.
Right.
Is there anything unconstitutional if the president is getting either directly or indirectly some compensation as a result of the deal that they're making. In other
Sure.
words, there's going to be all kinds of contracts for defense people and whatever to get the Saudis on board. And if it could be shown that the Trump family or people associated with them are getting some benefit, does that constitute a conflict of interest such as to
Interest
warrant the position?
that would be a violation of the emoluments clause of the Constitution and would be unconstitutional. Governments are allowed to give other governments gifts like airplanes or the Statue of Liberty, but you're not allowed to give gifts to an individual or an individual's family. That constitutes an unconstitutional emolument. So that issue may be litigated.
Sounds like it's going to be.
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to kind of conclude with asking you a question. And I know that this is going to require speculation, but you're a guy who's got the foundation to speculate with some reasonable degree of believability. So the question is, where are we going now constitutionally with this current administration?
Well, I think the problem goes beyond this administration. I think the problem goes to the woke generation. The fact that many people today, young people, believe that the ends justify the means. Many people today don't care about the Constitution. So I worry, if you want to predict what a country looks like in 20 years, look at its college students today. And the college students today do not seem to be people who are feel bound by the law. So I worry for our country, and I think we have to change the trajectory.
How do we do that?
Meritocracy, return to meritocracy. Stop with this diversity, equity, inclusion. Stop picking people based on their race or gender, and have all decisions made based on merit and meritocracy. I think that's necessary to return our country to its greatness.
Well, I want to again thank you, Alan.
My pleasure.
I learned so much from just talking to you, and even before we get on the shows and stuff, you're making me much more educated, and I love your books, by the way.
You'll learn even more if you read my book, The Preventive State. So you should do that. But I appreciate your having me. Thank you.
Well, I'll wait for the book number 58, and we'll do it again.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alan.
Sure. Bye.